Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony Podcast. Let's keep week 39 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this series, we've been getting to know Tolkien's circle of literary friends, the Inklings, a little bit better, and we've been using Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book to help us. Now, last time we wrapped up with Tolkien describing the encouragement of his friend, Lewis, as an unpayable debt. Today, we're going to move forward in the book a little bit. It's 1931 now, and the last year or two have been eventful for Lewis. He and his good friend, Owen Barfield, had, actually for years by this time, been engaged in correspondence that Carpenter says they called the Great War. Lewis had been of the opinion that the imaginative must be kept strictly apart from the rational. Now, Barfield disagreed and argued that purely rational argument relied on, as Carpenter says, artificial terms and had little to do with the actual business of life, and that imagination and aesthetic experience did lead, if not automatically to objective truth, then at least to a better understanding of the world. Now, while not completely agreeing with Barfield, Lewis, according to Carpenter, ceased to separate his emotional experiences from his intellectual process and came to regard joy and poetic vision in their way as truthful as rational argument and objective fact. Now, by 1929 and the time of his conversations with Tolkien, Lewis had come to accept theism, but not Christianity. As Lewis wrote, "My outlook is now definitely religious. It is not precisely Christianity, though it may turn out that way in the end." Now, Barfield still had a role to play. His argument that myth has a central place in the whole of language and literature was part of his book Poetic Diction, released in 1928, in which he concluded, in Carpenter's words, that mythology is closely associated with the very origin of all speech and literature. In the dawn of language, said Barfield, speakers did not make a distinction between the literal and the metaphorical, but used words in what might be called a mythological manner. For example, nowadays, when we translate the Latin spiritus, we have to render it either as spirit or as breath or as wind, depending on the context. But early users of language would not have made any such distinction between these meanings. To them, a word like spiritus meant something like spirit, breath, wind. When the wind blew, it was not merely like someone breathing, it was the breath of a god. And when an early speaker talked about his soul as spiritus, he did not merely mean that it was like a breath. It was to him just that, the breath of life. Mythological stories were simply the same thing in narrative form. In a world where every word carried some implication of the animate, and where nothing could be purely abstract or literal, it was natural to tell tales about the gods who ruled the elements and walked the earth. Now, that last little bit is how Carpenter summed up Barfield's argument in Poetic Diction. And if you've listened carefully, I'm sure you already are hearing shades of Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia in these same arguments. In fact, Poetic Diction had an impact on Tolkien. Lewis wrote to Barfield shortly after Poetic Diction was released, saying, "You might like to know that when Tolkien dined with me the other night, he said, apropos of something quite different, that your conception of the ancient semantic unity had modified his whole outlook, and that he was always just going to say something in a lecture when your conception stopped him in time. It is one of those things," Tolkien said, "that when you've once seen it, there are all sorts of things you can never say again." Now, with that all as background, I want to move to Saturday, September 19th, 1931. C.S. Lewis has invited two friends to dinner with him at Magdalen, J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. Now, regarding the latter, I'm just going to quote from Carpenter. Henry Victor Dyson Dyson, and no, that wasn't a typo, always known as Hugo, lectured in English literature at Reading University. He was a couple of years older than Lewis. He had been severely wounded in the First World War, had read English at Oxford, and was a practicing member of the Church of England. He was also exuberant and witty. Lewis had been introduced to him in July 1930 by Neville Coghill, and liked him so much that I determined to get to know him better. On further acquaintance, he found Dyson to be, quote, a man who really loves truth, a philosopher and a religious man, who makes his critical and literary activities depend on the former, none of your damn dilettanti. Now, after dinner, the three of them headed out for a stroll along a path that runs next to a few streams of the River Cherwell, there in Oxford, called Addison's Walk. Personal note, I've gone on Addison's walk each of the times that I've been fortunate enough to visit Oxford, mostly for Oxenmoots, and I highly recommend the experience, if for no other reason than to imagine yourself walking in the shoes of Tolkien and Lewis here. Now, during their walk, they talked about myths, and here I'll pick up from Carpenter again. Lewis had never underestimated the power of myth. Far from it, for one of his earliest loves had been the Norse myth of the dying god Balder. Now, Barfield had shown him the crucial role that mythology had played in the history of language and literature, but he still did not believe in the myths that delighted him. Beautiful and moving though such stories might be, they were, he said, ultimately untrue. As he expressed it to Tolkien, myths are lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. No, said Tolkien, they are not lies. Just then, Lewis afterwards recalled, there was a rush of wind which came so suddenly on the still, warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We held our breath. When Tolkien resumed, he took his argument from the very thing that they were watching. And that argument, central to Tolkien's Mythopoeia, is what we're going to come back to look at next week. For now, though, folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Please join me again next week as Tolkien explains the idea of subcreation to C.S. Lewis. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. Podcast app, follow or subscribe there, and follow at Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.